chapter 11 and 18. And last week, you'll recall, we started this 2 or 3. We were going to look at 2 or 3 prayer parables, what we're calling prayer parables. And we've already looked at, or at least read, the friend at midnight there in Luke 11. And both of these first two, actually all 3 of these parables, I believe, are only found in Luke. But we were looking at Luke 11 and Luke 18. And we looked at the background there of the first century, the poor living in this one-room home, people traveling at night, that kind of thing. And the friend is able to get what he needs because of his, King James says, importunity. But frankly, it is persistence. A good definition of that word is persistence to the point of shamelessness. He basically annoyed and begged and knocked until he got what he wanted or what he needed. Now the point, of course, there is not that we have to do that to God. He is always ever willing to listen and to give His children what they need. But there is a lesson for us, of course, in that as far as persistence is in our prayer lives. And we're going to come back and look at some more lessons together with that of the unjust judge or the persistent widow. But I guess you could probably sum up perhaps this parable with Romans 8:32, where Paul, through the Spirit, said, "He that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things?" God is a very loving, gracious giver. So therefore, unlike this situation, we don't have to beg to the point of shamelessness, but we do need to be persistent in our prayer lives. So turn back over then to Luke 18, and let's look at this first parable there, and then we'll kind of draw some lessons from both of these parables, the parable of the friend at midnight and then this unjust judge or persistent widow, whatever you want to call it. Now Jesus ends chapter 17 with some discussion of eschatological matters, that is His return, and the need for patience when it comes to God's judgment is concerned. And so it's important to understand the context with what He says at the end of this parable. But He says, "Then He spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not," I think the King James says faint. A good translation there is lose heart or give up or quit. Saying, the New King James says lose heart. Saying, "There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man." That is, he did not respect other people. And frankly, where you find people who don't respect or fear God, then you're also going to find people who don't do what? Respect other people. I mean, that's just the bottom line. I mean, we live in a world now in our society that teaches our children in public schools on a daily basis that they are the products of blind chance and really have no more value than a cockroach or some other creature. And then they wonder why they have no respect for authority and why they're killing each other. It's not rocket science, but I guess it is for most of these people. If you don't fear God, you're not going to respect men. But there was there was a widow in that city, and she came to him saying, "Get justice for me from my adversary. Give me my legal protections." And he would not for a while. He didn't care about her problems. You wonder too, being a single judge, this was probably as far as Jesus' parable to these people is concerned, they would envision a Roman judge probably, because the Jewish judges didn't sit one man at a time. They generally sat in groups of councils. And so perhaps a Roman judge. But remember when Paul was waiting there during the days of Felix, what was the deal with, what was Felix hoping to get when he kept putting Paul off, wouldn't do anything for him? Yeah, he was hoping to get a bribe. So I don't know, maybe this fellow's the same way. But at any rate, he wouldn't do anything about it. But afterward he said within himself, Though I do not fear God nor regard or respect man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. That is, she's going to wear me out. And in fact, these Greek words here, I'm trying to remember whether it was, I think the wearing out one, that he might reach the point of being worn out, literally means in the Greek to strike under the eye. In other words, to give somebody a black eye. So it's not that he thinks she's going to literally whack him, but it's just she's going to become such an annoyance. And just like we said in the previous parable, it's that old phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And he said, look, I don't really care about her, but she's going to wear me out. She's just bothering me. So I'll just take care of her problem. Now, but this is not, again, it's a matter of contrast. God's not like that. The Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said, and shall God not avenge? Look, this is an unjust judge, and he gets around to doing what he should be doing just because he doesn't want to be bothered. What about your loving heavenly Father? Shall he not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Now, don't get confused. Speedily there, not necessarily meaning within the time frame we think it ought to be taken care of, but when the time is right for God to take out his judgment, it happens speedily, right then. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? That is, what he's saying here is, going back to that previous chapter, when he was talking about his coming, when the Son of Man comes, whether it's in judgment upon the Jewish nation or whether it's in his final coming, will he find people who have this kind of persistent faith and prayer life? That is, the kind of faith that engages in this kind of persistent prayer life. That's the rhetorical question that he asks. So, let's put the two parables together and let's make some observations from the friend at midnight and this persistent widow. Number one, the first thing we want to learn about or really emphasize is our responsibility in prayer. Now notice the beginning of this parable. He spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray. What he's saying to us is men what? Must pray. Prayer is a commandment. And it's interesting when you go back to the context, go back to Luke chapter 11 of what led up to that parable. What led up to that? Go back to the beginning of chapter 11. Notice he was praying in a certain place. He was praying in a certain place when he ceased, that one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray. Now, prayer was not an unfamiliar thing to the apostles, but there was something different to them about Jesus' prayers from the prayers of the religious leaders of the day. And the other thing we want to point out, and I think we've already done so, but we want to mention it again, is how much Luke emphasizes the Christ and his prayer life, say opposed to the other synoptic gospels. All of the great incidents in Jesus' life in the book of Luke are ushered in with prayer. His baptism, Luke is the only one that mentions that in Luke chapter 3. It's Luke that tells us he continued all night in prayer before choosing his 12 in Luke chapter 6. The Great Confession at Caesarea Philippi is accompanied with prayer, Luke chapter 9. And he is the only writer to point out that Jesus was praying at the time of his glorification at the Mount of Transfiguration in Luke chapter 9. And so you've got this image of Jesus as a man of prayer. Then Luke also wrote what book? Acts. How many times do you see it mentioned in the book of Acts that the disciples were gathered together doing what? Praying. So, now let's think about this for a minute. Here is the Son of God, God in the flesh, who before anything major happens in His life is engaged in what? Prayer. On a regular basis He's praying. And His prayers are such that His disciples see that His prayers are different in their earnestness and in their simplicity. And they want to be taught by Him how to pray. Then you go to the book of Acts and you see His ambassadors, the only ambassadors He's ever had, by the way, His apostles, who hold a special office unlike anyone's ever had in the church, and yet we find them doing what on a regular basis? Praying. So, you take those 2 points, Jesus and the apostles, people of prayer, men of prayer, then of course what does that say to us 2,000 years later who are not inspired, who do not have any gifts of the Holy Spirit? Right? What does it say? We need to pray, on a regular basis. So we see the responsibility of prayer. Now let's look at some of the requirements of prayer. Effective prayer. Now what do you notice about the prayer of the friend, or the request of the friend and the widow, as opposed to sometimes prayers you hear today? But think about what when the friend went to knocking on his buddy's door, and when the widow went to the judge, it was definite. It was personal, and it was definite. Now, some of us tend to say the same prayer, what? Over and over again, no matter what the circumstances. And certainly, we know in public worship, prayers are different, at least they should be different. I mean, if I'm on the Lord's Supper table and I'm presiding, I should be praying about that, right? I can be thankful for the sacrifice of the Son, and I certainly need to thank Him for the emblems and the supper. But I don't need to be up here praying for the sick or for the country, while we're trying to focus on the death of our Lord. We call a closing prayer because it's supposed to be a closing prayer, not a 15-minute monologue. So we understand in public worship that prayers have certain purposes. So we've got to learn that in our own private, personal lives, that look, when we're alone and we've got things on our mind, our prayers need to be definite, not just generic all the time. I mean, God wants to hear, about what's going on in our lives. What do we need? In addition, of course, to praising and thanking Him. Friend, lend me 3 loaves. Hey, Mr. Judge, avenge me of my adversary. Those are pretty specific requests, Yeah, and I don't think that's exactly, you know how the Gentiles in their worship back then, the repetition was more of a form. Really, with that, yeah, right, yeah, and with that, we see that in some religious groups today, in the formality of their worship services, where they repeat this, some formula. Now that's the repetition he's talking about.
Special grace for somebody that repeats so many Hail Marys.
Yeah, so many Hail Mary and this, that, and they've got these formulas they say over and over again. But we're not even talking about that. Even our prayers, Christians sometimes, even though we're not like that, we're not being repetitious and using formulas that don't mean anything really after you've said them a bunch. We tend to be maybe too general, and then sometimes it gets to the point where that doesn't mean a whole lot to us. And so, we can be specific, and be specific depending upon whatever the occasion is, what we're praying for. If you're praying for your food, I mean, if you want to use it to pray for other things at home, that's fine. But I mean, if you're out praying for your food, I don't see anything wrong with just praying for your food. Um, and of course, when it comes to Jesus, they could see that about his sincerity. It came from the heart. Probably that's what astounded them more than anything, because like Dan just pointed out, the Jewish leaders of that day had a lot of formality and show to their prayers that you could tell were not earnest and were not from the heart. And certainly that would have been something different about Jesus' prayer. I mean, let's think about his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, it was so personal, so earnest, so heartfelt that what? You know, his sweat dropped from him, as it were, great drops of blood. I mean, let's think about it for a minute. If a child asks something of a parent, I mean, isn't the parent going to feel more of giving to that request if he feels like the child is earnest, if he's heartfelt about it, if he means it? I mean, if he can tell that the request doesn't mean anything to the child, then, you know, why should answering that request mean anything to him? And so, if it makes no difference to him. So God knows when we come to him with a request, whether we come in faith and we come in earnestness. And what's one of the ways he knows that? What is one of the ways that God knows that we really mean something, that we're really serious about this request? What would be one way God would know that we are serious about our request? Persistence is one, obviously, from these parables. Huh? All right, consistency. What else? There you go. What am I doing? What am I doing on my part to accomplish my request? Am I just, let's think about it for a minute. We get up here, Lord, we pray that everybody in the world will hear the gospel. Okay. Now what do? Lord, I hope my neighbor hears the gospel. Lord, I hope something happens to change so-and-so's mind. Okay? Then what do? Am I going to partake in my request? Am I going to do anything on my part to be active in that, whatever the situation is? I mean, isn't that a prayer of faith? Isn't a prayer of faith one that comes with my cooperation? One that says, look, yes, I need God. I need God to help me accomplish this. But, you know, there is something for me to do too that I can do. It may take more than me, but, or do I just leave it with Him and then expect Him to do all the work? Well, and that's the point. Well, I'm going to pray for the sick and the afflicted and the poor people. Okay. What did I do about the sick and afflicted last week? All right. Then we said it, of course, must be persistent. And that's really the major point of these two parables is persistence. You go back to Luke 11 and you notice what he said at the end of that parable. I say to you, verse 9, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. We mentioned, of course, that those are in the present tense, those verbs. And so what does that mean? Yeah, keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. It's not that God has to be bothered, but He does want His children to come to Him. Because if we do, then, number 3, we see the rewards of prayer, right? Was this fellow, was the friend at midnight, was he rewarded for his persistence? Was the widow rewarded for her persistence? Right? All right, what about this? Verse 10, for everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. To him who knocks it will be opened. If a son asks for bread from any father among you, will he give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? If he asks for an egg, will he offer him a scorpion? No, obviously not. The efforts will be rewarded. Now, of course, the problem that we have sometimes is that the reward either doesn't come on our timetable, or perhaps we ask for something and the God of heaven knows in His omniscience that either we don't need what we're asking for or we don't need it right then, or we need something else instead. Are there prayers in the Bible that went unanswered, or at least not answered the way that the person wanted? Do you read of any of those? Yeah, you do. Huh? Paul prayed that God remove that thorn in the flesh from him, whatever it was, and God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. It's just something you got to learn to deal with. Christ's prayer. The one that always, I think, is the most gut-wrenching in the Bible is David's prayer on behalf of his child, first child with Bathsheba. Prayed for days, didn't eat. Child died anyway. So he didn't get what he wanted, at least not then. But I like what one commentator says. This happens because, first of all, we can't see into the future. Second, we don't understand the past. And frankly, we know very little of the present when it gets down to it as human beings. But who alone knows all those things? God does. And so always in our prayer lives then, no matter how earnest and heartfelt our request, it always has to be in that context of what? We always have to have the understanding, well, what did Jesus always say? Thy will be done. You know what's best. This is what I think I want, but you know what's best for me. And sometimes people find out after they've asked for something, maybe a year later they're not asking for the same thing anymore. Maybe they figured out that's not something I needed or I wanted really or was good for me or whatever. Or some other opportunity came along that was better. Yeah.
I think we sometimes get in a position where we ask God for things and we just think we sit back and wait. We don't get them. Then you say God doesn't love us. And this, you make a good point about we have to become involved ourselves and not just say it to God and not do anything to help make it true.
Well, again, that gets back to it's a matter of faith. Where is our faith in these matters? Is our faith in God to do what's best? And again, it's not a matter of bugging Him until He just changes His mind and He's got set some. It's kind of like, again, in contrast to these parables, children sometimes can bug their parents to the point the parent finally just gives in and says, okay, fine. You're in the checkout line, right, at the store, and that's where they put all of the temptations. That's where they put all the candy and little toys and all that kind of stuff. And so the kid wants it, and you say no, and he starts throwing a temper tantrum. And if you're smart as a parent, you won't give in to that. You'll give him one of those phrases you heard when you were a kid. If you want to cry, I'll give you something to cry about or something. But you don't give in to that, because as soon as you give in to that, then he's got you. The 3-year-old's got you. But God, that's not the way it is with God, because He says here, when He does bless us, when He makes a determination that this is the course of action that's good for us, in His time frame and what's best for us, it will happen speedily. But it's on His time frame, and He knows what's best for us. So it's a matter of persistence, and prayer is a matter of faith. And frankly, for some of us, and I include all of us really in this, it's just a matter of doing it. We just need to do more of it. It is, in fact, it is a privilege. Yeah. No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, persistence can be just a matter of annoying God till we get our way, but God knows our heart. If our persistence stems from a realization that God is the only one that can answer our prayer and help us with our needs, then that's the kind of persistence I think that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and we see this, and we're going to see this in this next parable, that it's a matter of when you come to God and realizing that He is the only one to whom you can turn for this. I mean, this widow had no place else to go. I mean, I'm sure she would have liked to have gone to a judge that had a better disposition and temperament, but he was it. I mean, he was the only game in town. I mean, it was either get justice from him or nobody else. And I'm sure the friend who was banging on the door of his friend's house at midnight didn't want to have to do that to him, but he didn't have much choice if he was going to take care of the traveler and meet his social obligations of the day. So, as Brother Clark's pointed out, it's persistence, but it comes from a heart of knowing that, He's the only one that can take care of this. And as Marv pointed out, it is a privilege. Prayer is not just something that's promised. God's not promised that He'll just hear anybody's prayers in the sense of respecting them and answering them. Now, I know from Cornelius that look, it's not a matter of hearing, as in, did he hear it audibly? When we talk about God hearing prayer, we're talking about, does He respect them and answer them? And those outside of Christ don't have that promise that He will respect their prayer. Certainly in Cornelius' case, it was because he was looking in the right place for salvation, and he wanted help. But other than that, there's no promise that their prayers are going to get very far. But ours do, because He's our Father. And He's not the spiritual father of those outside of Christ. So it is a privilege. So we're back in Luke 18, and again, and he says, he keeps it in this same context, verse 9. Also, He spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. There's really a combination of lessons learned in this. It is in the context of prayer, but it's more than just about prayer. And I don't know, you can read some commentators. He puts these two parables together, and the way that the Oriental mind worked and the way they wrote, it's not always in chronological order. You understand that. When you read the Old Testament, and even events in the New Testament, they don't always happen in chronological order. The writer can be emphasizing different things. He takes things out of order. That's why the skeptic in the world who doesn't understand and doesn't want to understand the Bible will try to point out discrepancies or what he thinks are places where it contradicts itself when he doesn't understand how it was written. He thinks that a document 2,000 or 3,000 years old was written just like we write today, which is basically always in chronological order. But you know what? Even movies aren't that way. I don't know if he actually spoke this parable after the other one, or Luke just arranged it this way because they went together. But nevertheless, it says 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And, we know about the Pharisees, and we've mentioned this before. But again, they were the separated ones. They had their origins like most of these groups. We open the New Testament, and we've got all these people on the scene that weren't there 400 years ago when the Old Testament ended. And so you understand that when, after the Babylonian captivity and the return under the Persians, Alexander the Greek conquered the world in the 300s and basically spread Greek culture all over that part of the world. And so when he died and his son was murdered, his infant son was murdered, and his 4 generals divided up the world at that time, you ended up with 2 becoming the strongest, the Seleucids in the north in Syria, and the Ptolemies in the south in Egypt, the last Ptolemy ruler, of course, being Cleopatra. And they just fought back and forth for about 200 or 300 years over that little piece of land that people are still fighting over. Not so much over that land, but that just happened to be in the middle. And, the Jews, when they were under Ptolemy rule, things were pretty good. When they were under the Seleucid rule, things were terrible. You had Antiochus the Fourth, Epiphanes. The Jews called him Epimanes, a pig. And you finally had a revolt under the Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus and his sons. And all these groups arise in that intertestamental period for various reasons. The Pharisees arose because of their concern and rejection of the influence of Greek culture on Jewish society. The Sadducees imbibed Greek culture. They were the moderns, they were the liberals of the day, and they imbibed Greek culture. The Pharisees wanted to keep everything pure. As Paul said in Acts 26, he was of the straightest sect of the Jews. And so there was about 6,000 Pharisees during the time of Christ. And they, and again, that's a good idea, right, to keep yourself separate from that culture. The problem was they went too far with that, and they added their own laws and regulations, which they bound on people. And they also were religious show-offs, and frankly, they were religious snobs. And they looked down on everybody else. And nobody else was as good as they were. And so the publicans, of course, or tax collectors, were considered to be the worst sort of Jewish society. They're at the bottom because they're the traitors. And it's interesting, again, this Roman method of tax collection was actually borrowed from the Ptolemies. This was their method of tax collection. That is, the Romans said, okay, I'm going to give you these particular provinces, and we expect X amount of taxes per year from these 3 or 4 provinces, Mr. Tax Collector, and then whatever you collect over and above what we require is yours. That's your pay. And of course, the chief tax collectors had, other tax collectors under them until you got down to the bottom. And they had all kinds of fees and customs and tolls. And they taxed the people to death, and they were unscrupulous, and they cheated the people because the more they collected, the more they got to keep, because they only had to give the Romans a set amount. And of course, the Jews considered Jews who engaged in this tax collection system to be traitors, because they were working for the Romans. So I say all that to say this. In this parable, it is more shocking to these people than it is to us, because to these people, the Pharisee is what in the story? He's the hero. The tax collector is a villain. He's the dreg of society, whereas, the Pharisee is the one who was respected in society. So, they're at the opposite ends of the social ladder. One's an outcast, a traitor, a robber. One is the honored, respected religious leader. And the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. Actually was praying to himself, pretty much. Look at all the personal pronouns. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. How many times were the Jews required to fast during the whole year? Brother Don's got it. One time. Day of Atonement, right? That was it. That was the only requirement. According to scholars, the Pharisees chose Monday and Thursday of every week to fast. They did it twice a week. So that's a lot more than the requirement. I give tithes of all that I possess or all that I receive. His religion is one of what, basically? What does his religion consist of? No. But think about it. I mean, and we do this today. I mean, think about what we do today. Appearances. But isn't it a religion based upon the negative? It is a religion based upon what I do not do, as opposed to what I do positively. In other words, I don't lie, and I don't cheat, and I don't steal, and I don't commit adultery. I don't do all these things. Therefore, I'm a good guy because of what I don't do. Now, that's not to say that we should do those things. No, that's a good start. We don't do that. But Christianity is a positive religion that says, yeah, don't do those things. It is a religion of self-control, of temperance, but it is also a religion of service. Well, what do you do for God and other people? What does your life consist of? His was totally negative. Well, here's what I don't do. And he's pretty proud of that. And the tax collector, well, let's see. It is interesting, too, though, that even though the specifics of the parable is a tax collector and a Pharisee, notice how Luke starts the introduction. He spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves, and they were righteous and despised others. And the reason I say that is because Luke says, look, the application here is broader than just these two groups. And by the way, we're talking in generality. These are generalities anyway. It's for anybody that trusts in themselves and thinks they're better than others. After all, were all Pharisees bad guys? Could you say that every one of those 6,000 Pharisees during the time of Christ was a bad guy? Well, I could think of at least two that are mentioned in the New Testament that were very good guys. Who? Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. So not every one of them were bad guys, just like a lot of tax collectors were scumbags. No question. Remember Zacchaeus? He was cheating people till Jesus came along. So, there's a broader lesson here. But the tax collector stands afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast. That's repeatedly saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He's gone to the only source that can help him. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified. Justified, there's a legal concept. Rather than the other, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. And he who humbles himself will be exalted. And so, let's talk about the two prayers. I've already mentioned that the Pharisee's prayer was one of what you might call imperfect goodness. He only talks about, it consists of negative conduct, things that I have not done. And he became very satisfied with his life, very content with that. And he also makes the mistake of measuring himself by what? And we do this today too. He made the mistake of measuring himself by what? Other people. I'm better than this guy, so that must mean I'm a pretty good guy. That's always a mistake, to start measuring ourselves by other people. because he was sure heaven was his compared to some other people. And frankly, how much credit is it to him that he's a little better than a tax collector? Well, I'm better than him. Okay. Not sure what that means. And that's an insecure and immature thing that we do even today. We try to make others look bad to do what? Yeah, make ourselves look good. And of course, it was a prayer of pride, one that dealt in a lot of personal pronouns. Notice his gratitude wasn't to God personally, but his gratitude was what? His gratitude was for what? Yeah, that I'm a great guy. He was just thankful to God that I'm such a good guy. Did he really ask God for anything? Yeah, he didn't ask God for anything. Pretty self-sufficient. All right. Well, we'll stop here and finish this up. This is our last of the prayer parables, and we'll be moving on. I'm not sure what's next. But whatever it is, this is our 22nd parable. We got a few more to cover.